It was a Monday in late October, and the city lay under a dome of reluctant light. The air had that Oxford dampness about it, as though every cobblestone had soaked itself in centuries of rain, and every stone building carried its own faint exhalation of fatigue. I remember pausing outside the Ashmolean, not because I had business there, but because I disliked the thought of returning to my flat too soon. One grows wary of silence, especially the kind that makes itself too much at home. The buses wheezed past with their usual indignation. The cyclists cut diagonally across the traffic with that imperious self-certainty only students possess, and the shop fronts, with their neat displays of scarves and books, seemed to mock the greyness. I lingered by the traffic lights, watching people move in ways that suggested purpose, even if the purpose itself was trivial. I envied them, though I couldn't have said why. I'd tucked into my pocket a folded clipping from the Oxford Mail, a short notice, barely more than 2 sentences, about the sudden death of a retired librarian, a woman of no particular fame, no obvious fortune, and, it seemed, no surviving family, the kind of life that slips away with hardly a ripple. Yet the brevity of the report, the oddly hesitant phrasing about circumstances not considered suspicious, unsettled me. Language, after all, betrays the writer's doubt long before it betrays the truth. I walked on, passing the Sheldonian, its solemn windows staring down as if they too were keeping secrets. In the quadrangles, the autumn leaves had begun to drift into careful patterns, as though nature herself attempted her hand at symmetry. A young couple stood beneath the bridge of sighs, the girl leaning against the parapet, the boy speaking with hands more than words. I noticed, not for the first time, how silence often speaks louder than declarations. In Carfax, I ducked into a pub that had the advantage of not being popular with tourists. The oak beams sagged with respectable weariness, and the carpet carried the faint musk of old ale and older tobacco. I sat by the window, ordered a pint, and opened the crossword. For a time I allowed myself the distraction of clues and crossings. A 7-letter word for regret. Remorse. Too obvious. A 9-letter word for concealment. Obscurity. Better, though the letters resisted me. The puzzle, like life, offered its satisfactions reluctantly. A man in a tweed jacket occupied the table near mine, nursing half a bitter. He was reading a volume of Donne, his lips shaping fragments of the verse as though he could taste them. I wondered, not without a pang of envy, if poetry gave him what whiskey occasionally afforded me, a temporary gentleness against the weight of things best left unspoken. It was while shading in a tentative answer that the clipping slid from my pocket and fell to the floor. I stooped to retrieve it, but not before the man glanced at it. He remarked softly, and without turning his head, that she had been his supervisor once, years ago. An exacting woman, he said, with an aversion to untidiness, the kind who corrected your pronunciation of Latin authors in the middle of a crowded seminar. And yet, he added after a pause, she had lately become absent-minded, forgetful. Not like her. That stray comment remained with me. Not like her. I underlined the phrase in my mind, as one might underline a stubborn clue in the crossword. For if a woman defined by precision had grown careless, then perhaps the sudden ending of her life was not as uneventful as the paper suggested. By the time I finished my drink, the rain had begun in earnest. Oxford, seen through the smeared pane of glass, looked like a city half dissolving into its own memory. I folded the clipping carefully this time, placed it back in my pocket, and stepped outside. The streets were darker now, the cobblestones shining like coins too old to spend. I knew, though I would not admit it aloud, that the grey afternoon had already committed me. There are moments when the city whispers a summons, and one ignores it at one's peril. The news reached me in the way such things often do, half heard, half believed, carried on the uncertain authority of a porter who had learned it from a scout, who had overheard it from a secretary. A don, one of the older ones, had been found dead in his rooms at one of the smaller colleges, the sort of story that trembles on the line between tragedy and inevitability. Old men, after all, do die. Yet Oxford has never permitted the comfort of inevitability. There is always a shadow at the edge of the light, always a whisper in the stones that the story is never quite so simple. I walked slowly across the High, the rain clinging to my coat like an unwanted confidant. The college stood discreetly apart from the busier streets, its gatehouse hunched against the drizzle, the lantern above the arch barely alive in the dim light. The porter, a square man with a moustache that looked inherited rather than grown, greeted me with the wary civility of someone who has been told to cooperate but resents the necessity. He said little, only that the rooms had been sealed and that the police surgeon had already paid his visit. I found myself reassured by his economy of words. Too much talk is always a form of concealment. The Don in question, Dr. Alwyn Meredith, had been a fellow in classics, known less for brilliance than for persistence. His lectures, I was told, were sparsely attended, yet he published steadily enough to maintain the illusion of relevance. His rooms, when I entered, seemed at once both lived in and deserted. The fire gone cold, the curtains half drawn against the wet afternoon, a scattering of papers across the desk as though interrupted mid-thought. The smell was not yet of death, but of its anticipation, dust, damp wool, a trace of pipe tobacco that seemed unwilling to fade. He lay in the armchair by the hearth, tilted slightly to one side, his head resting against the fabric as though he had simply drifted into sleep. His shoes were polished, his trousers neatly creased, and one hand still clutched the armrest with a tension that death had not quite undone. On the small table beside him stood a glass, a third full of whiskey, and an open bottle whose level suggested he had not been sparing. I remember thinking, not without sympathy, that he had chosen his companion well for the final evening. But something jarred, a detail small enough to be dismissed, yet insistent. The book on his lap, a volume of Thucydides, lay open not at the center, but within the first few pages. A man of Meredith's age and discipline would never have read so far, only to begin again. It was not a borrowed book. The binding bore his own name in faded gilt. And yet the page was marked with an intensity of pencil annotations, each line bracketed, each phrase underlined as though newly discovered. An old man rereading what he already knew, or someone attempting to understand in haste what time had long denied them. I paced the room, noting the uneven stack of letters on the bureau, the cracked saucer beneath the teacup, the damp umbrella leaning by the door. Each item is ordinary enough, yet the whole thing is uneasy. I remembered a crossword clue from that morning, the answer to which had been palimpsest. Writing over writing, words erased but never gone, the ghost of the first text still visible beneath the second. Meredith's life, I thought, might well have been such a palimpsest, the respectable surface covering over older, darker inscriptions. A knock at the door announced the college chaplain, a thin man with restless eyes and a voice that seemed perpetually pitched for evensong. He murmured that Meredith had been in ill health, a weak heart, and that his passing, though sad, should not occasion undue suspicion. He paused, however, before adding that the Don had lately become agitated, troubled by some matter he did not share. A scholar who spent his years among dead languages, suddenly unsettled by the living world. The chaplain crossed himself as he spoke, not so much in piety as in nervous habit. I left him to his prayers and stepped once more into the quad. The rain had slackened, though the flagstones still gleamed like wet parchment. Students hurried past with their books held close, their faces pale against the gathering dusk. I thought of Meredith, his pencil pressed too firmly against ancient text, his hand gripping the chair as though resisting something unseen. Death by natural causes, perhaps. And yet, there are pauses in language, silences in print, that convey more than words ever could. That evening, in the pub near St. Giles, I filled the empty spaces of the crossword with guesses I knew were wrong. concealment, betrayal, omission? The answers eluded me, as they so often did. But the pattern, faint though it was, had begun to emerge. Oxford is a city that has perfected the art of concealment. Its streets and quadrangles are dressed in history, but behind the walls one finds the same litany of human vanities, jealousies, disappointments, resentments so carefully clothed they resemble virtues. I knew that if Meredith had not died as quietly as the authorities wished to believe, then somewhere among the gowns and the townsfolk was the restless seed of discontent that had ripened into silence. I began, as one does, with the fellows of his college. Over sherry in the common room, I encountered Dr. Forbes, a historian whose mind lived perpetually in the Middle Ages. He dismissed Meredith as an unremarkable man, stubborn in his attachment to texts long since plundered by better scholars. Yet there was a faint curl at the corner of his mouth as he said it, as though mediocrity itself could be a provocation. When I asked whether Meredith had enemies, he responded that Oxford has no enemies, only rivals, and that the difference was largely semantic. I filed the remark away with the care of a librarian shelving a book he does not intend to read again. Later, in a cafe off the Broad, I spoke with one of Meredith's former students. She was a sharp young woman with dark hair cropped at the chin, her notebooks littered with marginalia that seemed half code, half confession. She told me Meredith had been exacting, almost cruel in his critiques, but never indifferent. She suspected, though, that he had grown afraid of being irrelevant. I asked what made her think so. She stirred her tea and replied that he had begun to ask her opinion. It was a small answer, but it glowed faintly in my mind. Pride does not ask questions unless it is already weakening. From there I moved into the town, where gossip travels with greater velocity than fact. In a narrow bookshop on Holywell Street, the proprietor, an elderly man with nicotine-stained fingers, remembered Meredith as a regular customer. He purchased obscure titles, sometimes in Greek, sometimes in translation, but always in cash. Nothing suspicious in itself, but the bookseller recalled a particular 18th-century edition of Lucretius that Meredith had insisted on collecting in person late one evening, long after the shop had closed. The memory clung to me like a damp coat. Why such urgency for a book already 2 centuries old? Unless the book was less important than what it might have concealed. It was dusk when I walked back across the cobbled lanes. Students hurried past me, some laughing too loudly, others burdened with bags of library books. I thought of Meredith again, seated in his chair with that book on his lap, as though waiting for an answer he would never read. The streets hummed with the ordinary noises of the city, but I carried his silence with me like contraband. That night, in my room, I unfolded the crossword. One clue read, "Scholar's rival, hidden within enmity." The answer, of course, was the enemy, concealed inside the letters themselves. I stared at it for longer than necessary. Forbes had said Oxford has no enemies, only rivals, but the clue suggested otherwise. Rivalries disguise enemies, enemies disguise rivalries. Words blur, but the meaning endures. I also thought of the student's remark that Meredith had begun to ask. A man defined by certainty, turning suddenly to doubt. And of the bookseller's recollection, a scholar hurrying through the rain for a book that should have waited for him. Each fragment is no more than a shadow, yet shadows, when layered, give shape to the unseen. I poured myself a measure of whiskey, the kind that burns before it soothes, and listened to the city settling into its nocturnal hush. Somewhere, beyond the spires and the sodden leaves, was the truth about Meredith's last days. Whether he had died of weakness or of something less merciful, I could not yet say. But the city, with its muttered confidences and hidden alcoves, had already provided me with enough suspects. The historian with his veiled disdain, the student with her intimations of fear, the bookseller with his memory of an urgent errand. They lingered in my mind, not as characters, but as questions, and Oxford, I knew, would be slow to answer them. The library at Meredith's College had the solemnity of a chapel. Its windows, long and high, admitted a muted light that clung to the spines of books as if reluctant to disturb their sleep. I walked slowly between the rows, hearing the faint creak of the floorboards echo back upon itself, the sound of solitude rehearsing its own performance. I have always felt that libraries contain not merely knowledge, but silence distilled into something tangible, something that can press against the lungs. The librarian, a small woman with steel-grey hair pinned too tightly, regarded me as though I were an intruder in a sanctuary. She admitted, however, that Meredith had spent many of his final afternoons here. Always with Thucydides or Lucretius, she said, and always in the same carrel by the far wall. She seemed almost offended that I should inquire, as though scholarship itself ought to be immune to scrutiny. Yet she lowered her voice when she added that he had left a book unreturned, a most unusual lapse. It was a 1723 edition of Lucretius, the very text the bookseller had recalled with unease. The carrel still bore his presence in absence. A scrap of paper lay folded beneath the desk lamp. A fragment of notes, half a sentence in Greek, the ink slightly smudged. I could not help but notice that the words ceased abruptly, mid-thought, as though the writer had been summoned away by something stronger than reason. I touched the paper gently, conscious of the residual warmth of intention that lingers in unfinished work. There is a cruelty in interruption. I examined the Lucretius volume more carefully. The pages were thin, brittle, with margins wide enough for centuries of commentary. Yet near the middle, a gap revealed itself. A single leaf had been excised with a blade so clean that at first one might have thought it an accident of binding. It was, of course, no accident. Libraries preserve, they do not destroy. A missing page is a scream in a place that should only whisper. I asked the librarian if such a thing had ever occurred before. She shook her head. Books, she insisted, were guarded with the diligence of relics. Then, almost as if against her will, she confessed that Meredith had once argued with another fellow about access to restricted holdings. His voice had carried through the walls, she said, brittle and sharp. She could not hear the words, only the insistence, as though knowledge itself were a contested possession. She paused, then whispered that Meredith had left the library that day with his hands trembling. I stood by the tall window and watched the rain trickle down the glass in hesitant rivulets. Students passed in the quad below, their umbrellas small, dark constellations drifting across the stone. My thoughts returned to the crossword from the previous night. The clue had been absent within text, the answer elided. I had written lacuna, though with doubt. Here, before me, was the embodiment of that word, a void where something essential should have remained. The deduction was simple, yet the implication was vast. Someone had wanted not the whole book, but that absence. The page mattered more than the volume. I lingered in the library until the lamps began to cast their tired glow, until the librarian's footsteps grew impatient in their rhythm. She asked if I had found what I was looking for. I told her that I had found what was missing, which was more important. She did not understand, or perhaps preferred not to. Libraries are places where omissions are feared as much as intrusions. As I stepped back into the evening, the rain struck harder, as though determined to erase what little clarity the day had yielded. The bells tolled across the city, their iron notes resonating in the damp air. I carried with me the image of that missing page, severed neatly from its spine, and thought how lives too are torn from their bindings, leaving the survivors to wonder at the gaps. In Meredith's case, the lacuna was not merely academic. It was the beginning of a question that no one wished to ask. It was in the quiet of my room that evening, the drizzle against the window panes keeping time with my thoughts, when the crossword once again found its way before me. The Times had set a particularly cryptic grid that day, as though conspiring with Oxford itself to withhold what mattered most. I stared at the black and white pattern, sensing in its intersecting clues the same hidden geometry that governed Meredith's death. The two grids, one of words, the other of lives, seemed bound together by a stubborn refusal to yield. The first clue I considered was the scholar's decline noted in Marginalia 7. The answer arrived reluctantly, like a late guest to supper another. A word both ordinary and accusatory. I thought of Meredith's penciled markings in the Lucretius, his sudden re-engagement with pages he must have read dozens of times. A decline indeed, for scholars decline not in the body first, but in the desperation with which they cling to the text. His last days had been lived in the margins, the main body already receding from his grasp. I carried these thoughts with me into the quad the following morning. The flagstones were still wet, reflecting the pale light in fragments. I noticed two fellows speaking in hushed tones near the chapel steps, their gowns hanging like shadows upon them. When they saw me, one smiled too quickly, too politely, and the other turned his gaze to the ground. I offered a few perfunctory words about the weather, and though they responded in kind, I heard nothing but evasion in their replies. It struck me then that conversation itself is often a crossword word meant to mislead, to distract, to fill spaces with appearances rather than truths. Later, in a coffee house near the covered market, I met the same student who had spoken to me about Meredith before. She sat hunched over her notebook, the edges of the pages curled from use. I asked her what she was writing, and she answered only that it was nothing important. But when her sleeve slipped slightly, I glimpsed the margin of one page, a sketch of the missing leaf's watermark, exact in detail, drawn from memory rather than possession. I asked her how she had seen it, and she colored faintly before saying that Meredith had once shown her. He had asked her opinion about that word, asked as though she might illuminate what he no longer could. It was a curious gesture, one I tucked carefully away. For if he trusted her enough to reveal the page, he must have trusted her with something else, something larger. Trust is a rare currency in Oxford, and it is seldom spent without reason. That evening, I sat with the crossword once more. A clue near the center demanded my attention. Lie concealed in conversation 5. The answer was elide, to omit, to suppress. I thought of the two fellows by the chapel, their words careful yet incomplete. I thought of the student, her answers truncated, as if she had cut away the heart of her reply. Elision is as telling as confession. The words not spoken are often louder than those that are. With whiskey at my side, I allowed the letters to form a pattern, the grid slowly filling with approximations, guesses, tentative certainties, much like the investigation itself. Meredith's life, too, had been a crossword, each clue embedded in fragments of conversation, each answer provisional until confirmed by the intersecting letters of another story. Yet what remained stubbornly absent was the central word, the one that tied all others together. I felt the weight of it like a stone in my pocket. I slept poorly, the rain a restless metronome outside. At some indeterminate hour, I woke with a sentence lingering at the edge of thought he had lived in the margins. Not only in the margins of books, but in the margins of Oxford itself, respected but never celebrated, tolerated but never embraced. And yet, in those margins, something had been written that others wished erased. The missing page was not merely an absence but an intention. Someone had chosen to excise it, just as one chooses to elide a word in speech. The crossword remained unfinished on my desk, several clues still resisting me. But I did not mind. Ambiguity has its own integrity. What is withheld can be more illuminating than what is revealed. Meredith's death was still a grid of empty spaces, but I knew enough to sense the shape beneath. Evening had already folded itself over the city when I returned to the college. The quad glowed faintly beneath the lanterns, their yellow halos spreading like stains across the damp stone. Oxford wears darkness with such practiced grace that one is almost deceived into believing it was designed for shadow rather than illumination. I paused beneath the archway, listening to the muffled echo of my own steps, and wondered how many lives had ended in such borrowed light, neither wholly hidden nor fully revealed. Meredith's rooms, though sealed, remained in my mind. I thought of the fire unlit, the curtains half drawn, and the whiskey abandoned mid-measure. There was something staged about the scene, as though death itself had been rehearsed to mislead. False light, I murmured inwardly, remembering the way the table lamp had cast its glow not upon the book he held, but upon an empty corner of the desk. It had struck me then as odd, and odder still as the memory persisted. Scholars arrange their light carefully. Illumination is their craft. Why had his lamp turned away from the page? I drifted into the chapel, deserted at that hour, the air carrying its usual scent of wax and damp hymnals. A single candle burned near the altar, throwing long shadows up the wall. I sat in the back pew, trying not to imagine Meredith kneeling here in some final attempt at solace. A voice interrupted the chaplain again, his tone lowered as though we shared a conspiracy. He remarked that Meredith had lately attended evening prayer with unusual regularity. He had sat in the same place each time, beneath the north window, where the light from the candles distorted the colors of the glass. A false light once more. He added that Meredith never joined in the prayers, but stared instead at the flickering patterns as though they concealed some private code. I asked whether anyone else had noticed this. The chaplain hesitated, then admitted that another fellow, Forbes the historian, had once confronted him about Meredith's distractions. A man seeking faith where he had never sought it before, Forbes had said, or perhaps seeking something else entirely. I left the chapel with the weight of those words pressing against me. In Oxford, faith is seldom pure. It is another form of inquiry, sharpened by doubt. Back in my room, the crossword awaited. A clue stood unfinished: illumination that deceives 5. The answer fell easily, now glare, a brightness that blinds rather than clarifies. I considered how glare disguises detail, how too much light can obscure as effectively as too little. The lamp angled away, the candlelight refracted through glass, each a form of concealment masquerading as revelation. Meredith's final days had been lived beneath such deceptive brightness. The following afternoon, I found myself speaking once more with the student, her notebook half concealed under her arm. I asked if she had ever seen Meredith work by lamplight. She looked at me with a faint smile, almost pitying, and replied that he had a habit of turning the lamp deliberately away from his books. He said it allowed him to see the page without distraction, as though the margin might reveal what the text itself withheld. Her words lingered, suggesting a man who sought meaning not in what was present, but in what hovered just beyond sight. And I thought again of the missing page, removed with surgical precision, a false light upon an absence. Whoever had cut it away understood Meredith's habits too well, knew where he looked when others did not. That night, as I poured the last of the whiskey, I allowed the idea to settle like sediment at the bottom of a glass. The truth itself can be hidden, not by darkness, but by too much light. Oxford gleamed around me with its lanterns and lamps, but I had learned to distrust the glow. Meredith had died in brightness, yet I felt more certain than ever that his ending belonged to the shadows. The rain had softened into a mist when I found myself walking toward the Sheldonian, drawn less by purpose than by the vague hope of distraction. Music was being rehearsed within the organ, swelling and subsiding like the breath of something vast. I have often thought that Oxford contains more echoes than voices, and that its music, too, belongs as much to memory as to sound. I slipped quietly into the back, letting the notes settle around me like dust disturbed in an old library. I had not come here to think of Meredith, yet of course he followed me, as stubborn as the motif in a fugue. He had been a man of words, not music, yet I remembered that once, years before, I had seen him attend a concert in the Holywell music room. He had sat alone, leaning forward as if the sound might conceal a secret. I wondered whether he had sought in harmony what he could not find in text, the consolation of pattern without interpretation. The choir was rehearsing Bird. Their voices rose, interweaving, dissolving into one another. For a moment, the city outside ceased to exist, the drizzle erased by polyphony. And then, as the alto's line strained slightly out of pitch, I thought of Meredith's pencil annotations again, how the pressure of his hand had faltered in places, the letters uneven, like notes drifting from the key. A man's decline revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in these slight betrayals of rhythm. Afterwards, I spoke with one of the choristers, a young man whose gown was too long for his narrow frame. He remembered Meredith, too, though only as a figure occasionally passing through the quad at dusk. He said that the dawn would often pause by the chapel when music was being sung, not entering, but standing outside with his head tilted, as though collecting fragments from the air. The detail struck me more deeply than I cared to admit. To stand on the threshold of music, neither within nor without, was to live in perpetual suspension, half denied, half invited. Later that evening, I found myself in my room with a record spinning faintly on the turntable. Schubert, a slow adagio, the kind that breaks rather than consoles. The whiskey had lost its warmth by then, leaving only a dry bitterness on the tongue. I turned once more to the crossword, though the grid blurred as the music deepened. A clue stood unfinished, an echo of a past note, unresolved 6. I wrote a refrain, though without certainty. To refrain, to echo, to hold back. All three meanings whispered into one. Meredith had refrained from explanation, from confession, from finishing his sentence on that abandoned scrap of paper. A refrain of silence, more eloquent than any phrase he might have written. The next morning I called upon Forbes again. He received me with the brittle patience of a man whose time had been conscripted unwillingly. I asked him whether Meredith had cared for music. Forbes smiled thinly and said that Meredith disdained it, considering it inferior to words. But then, after a pause, he admitted that in recent months Meredith had asked to borrow records from his collection, a request so out of character that Forbes had assumed it was a whim. He had lent him a recording of Bird's Masses. Meredith had never returned it. I walked back through the drizzle, haunted by that unreturned record. Music, like books, leaves an imprint on its listener, though the imprint cannot be footnoted. Perhaps Meredith had sought something beyond text, beyond annotation, memory that could not be erased like a missing page. False light had concealed him, yes, but music, I felt, had revealed the fracture. That night I sat once more by the window, the fog pressing against the glass, the city muted into stillness. Schubert played softly, the refrain lingering on the edge of resolution, never quite finding it. I thought of Meredith in his chair, head tilted as though straining for a note he could not catch. The city was filled with echoes, and some of them, I knew, would never fade. There are certain afternoons in Oxford when the sky appears undecided, neither grey nor blue, but suspended in a colourless hesitation. It was in such a light that I returned to Meredith's rooms, the porter letting me in with a grudging nod, as though complicit in an intrusion that decency forbade but duty allowed. The air had shifted since my first visit, less the immediacy of death now, more the faint must of abandonment. Yet the desk, the chair, the scattered papers, still carried the weight of a life paused rather than ended. I turned to the books on his shelves, volumes arranged with an order too meticulous to be mistaken for casual habit. They were aligned like sentinels, the spines clean, the dust disturbed only recently. I pulled down one at random, a well-thumbed copy of Horace, and opened it to the flyleaf. There, in Meredith's hand, was an inscription, the Latin characters carefully formed, but with a faint smudge at the edge. The phrase struck me as odd. Quid est veritas? A question attributed to Pilate, not Horace. What truth is this? And below, in a darker ink, a second hand had altered a letter, transforming veritas into vanitas. Vanity. A single stroke shifting truth into emptiness. I examined it more closely, tracing the faded mark where the original letter had been obscured. Someone had meddled discreetly but unmistakably. The ink seemed newer, its gloss still faintly perceptible in the lamplight. An inscription altered as though to mock him or to remind him of something he had sought to forget. The page, like the missing leaf in Lucretius, carried its own wound. I asked the porter later whether anyone had been in Meredith's rooms since his death. Only the college staff, he replied curtly, and the chaplain, who had insisted on saying prayers over the body. The chaplain again, with his nervous cross and lowered voice, drifting like a shadow through the college corridors. I made a note of it, though the note itself felt unnecessary. Memory was sufficient. Memory is more damning than ink. The crossword that evening seemed to conspire once more. Alteration in text conceals meaning 7. The answer, palimpse. A fragment of palimpsest, the old text scraped away, a new one written over it, yet the ghost of the first always remains. Meredith's life again, the missing page, the altered inscription, the elided conversations. Each gesture the same concealment through transformation, truth twisted into vanity. I visited the student the following day, her notebook still a constant presence, her hands smudged faintly with graphite. I asked whether Meredith had ever spoken of inscriptions. She looked at me with a startled expression, then lowered her gaze. Once, she admitted, he had shown her the Horace volume. He told her that the greatest danger in scholarship was not error, but alteration, that to change a word was to alter not only its meaning, but its history. She hesitated then, as though uncertain whether to continue, before whispering that Meredith had accused someone of tampering with his books. He had not said who. It was not the content of her reply that arrested me, but the manner in which she spoke. Her eyes flickered momentarily toward the window, as if fearing to be overheard. Gesture, small but revealing. Not fear of me, but fear of something larger, perhaps the same presence that had cut the page, darkened the ink. I left her with a sense that confession hovered close, but confession is like music, it must be coaxed, not demanded. Back in my room, I set the Horace beside the crossword. One question in print, one in puzzle, each offering the same riddle. What is truth, and what is vanity? I could not answer either fully. Yet I sensed that Meredith's final days had been shadowed by someone who understood too well how to alter without erasing, how to inscribe deceit within the very text of his life. The city outside was dark by then, lanterns glowing uncertainly in the mist. I listened to the faint hum of traffic on the high, the occasional ring of a bicycle bell fading into silence, and I thought of that single letter, transformed by an unseen hand, shifting truth into emptiness. It seemed to me the most Oxford of acts, subtle, quiet, devastating. Meredith had died in a room where words had been rewritten, and words, when altered, can kill as surely as any weapon. The envelope reached me late in the afternoon, slipped under my door by hands I never saw. No address, no sender, only my name written in a script too formal to be casual. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed faintly at the edges, and upon it a poem copied in Meredith's hand, or at least a hand intended to be his. The lines were from Horace, but wrong in cadence, wrong in selection, A translation, perhaps, but of such clumsy phrasing that Meredith, pedant that he was, would never have tolerated it. A poem attributed, altered, corrupted. The wrong poem. I studied the sheet for some time, the words blurring as the dusk crept into the room. The Latin was genuine enough, but the English beneath it faltered. Vanity dressed as truth. It echoed the altered inscription I'd found in his Horace volume on letter turned, veritas into vanitas. And now here, a whole poem bent out of shape. It was not ignorance, but intention. Someone wanted him to read the error and take it for meaning. That evening I carried the paper to the pub, ordered a pint I scarcely touched, and laid the sheet beside the crossword. The grid had been cruel that day, each clue entangled with the next, offering no certainty. One clue asked, verse misquoted conceals intent. 6. I tried lyrics, stanza, but neither fit. Finally, I wrote a parody. To alter through mimicry, to disguise contempt as homage. The wrong poem was a parody in every sense, a mockery of truth. Meredith, a man of annotations, could not have overlooked the false hand. He must have known, and if he knew, he must have felt the trap tightening. Across the room, a man in tweed watched me too carefully, his newspaper held as a shield. I pretended not to notice. Oxford is a city where eyes linger longer than propriety allows, but rarely without reason. I folded the poem away, finished the drink, and left. The next morning, returned to Meredith's college. The chaplain intercepted me in the cloister, his voice lower than the wind that rattled the ivy. He said Meredith had left no note, no farewell, but he had once quoted a line of poetry in conversation. Something about death coming not as a thief but as a guest. The chaplain smiled faintly, as though reassured by the memory. I knew, however, that he misremembered. The poem he paraphrased belonged to Donne, not Horace, and the line itself had been altered. Again, the wrong poem. I asked whether Meredith had seemed troubled. The chaplain looked down at his shoes before answering. He had spoken of shadows at noon, he said, of false light. The words lingered like smoke in the air, but the chaplain hurried away before I could press him further. Later, I sought the student once more. She was in the Bodleian, her fingers tracing the spines of books as though they were instruments she alone could play. I placed the copied poem before her, and she read it without surprise. She told me Meredith had shown her a similar sheet weeks earlier. He had asked her to compare it with the original, as if testing her. She had told him it was wrong. He had smiled, she said, not in amusement but in resignation. I asked who might have given it to him. She shook her head, then added softly that it was not given, but left. Slipped under his door, just as mine had been. That night, the crossword offered one last clue. False text, true effect 5. I wrote fraud, though the word felt too blunt. The wrong poem was more delicate than fraud. It was a thread pulled loose from the fabric of scholarship, a deliberate warp in the weave. And Meredith, already fragile, had lived long enough in the margins to hear the silence louder than the words. I sat by the window as the bells tolled across the city, carrying their fractured music through the mist. The poem lay folded in my pocket, heavier than its single sheet could justify. Meredith had died surrounded by books, yet undone by a text he did not write. The wrong poem had been placed before him, and he'd understood too well what it meant. In Oxford, words are never merely words. They are weapons, subtle and precise, and sometimes they kill by what they withhold. It was in the Ashmolean, beneath the weight of statues that stared without sight, that the confession finally took shape. The museum had always unsettled me, its air too still, its marble too pale, the silence of antiquity pressing closer than comfort allowed. I walked its galleries often, not for solace, but because silence there seemed more articulate than elsewhere. That afternoon, however, the silence broke. I found her seated in the Greek sculpture hall, the student whose notebook never left her hands. She sat on the bench opposite the fractured torso of Apollo, the god forever mutilated by time, her eyes fixed not on the marble but on the page she clutched. She looked up as I approached, and for the first time there was no defiance in her gaze, only fatigue. She said that Meredith had trusted her and that she had failed him. The words sounded rehearsed, like a phrase copied again and again until its meaning thinned. She told me that he had given her the missing page, weeks before his death. He had asked her to guard it, not in the library, but in herself, to hold its meaning until he could decide what to do. She had studied it obsessively, copying the watermark, sketching the faded lines of annotation. And then, one night, the page had been taken from her room. She never discovered how. She said this with her hands folded tightly together, as though she feared they might betray her. I asked her what the page contained. She shook her head. It was not what it contained, but what it implied, a reference misattributed, a line falsified. A scholar's reputation could collapse upon such a discovery. Meredith had known it. Someone else knew it too. She whispered that he had grown paranoid, certain that the wrong poem, the altered inscription, the page cut from his book were all part of the same pattern. He had begun to write a letter, but never finished. She lowered her voice further and said she believed he was frightened not of being exposed, but of being silenced. I sat beside her in the stillness of the hall, the museum's hush broken only by the faint echo of footsteps from distant galleries. I thought of the crossword folded in my coat pocket, half completed, its clues resistant. One in particular returned to me. Confession revealed in fragments. 7. I had left it blank the night before. Now the answer arrived with a cruel clarity. Admitted. To let in. To acknowledge. A confession is not revelation, but admission, the opening of a door. She had opened hers, though only part way. I pressed her no further. In her silence, there was more truth than in any word she might have given. She rose at last, placed the notebook upon the bench, and walked out through the great doors into the gathering rain. I did not follow. The notebook lay unopened beside me, its cover smudged with graphite and rain. I did not touch it. Some confessions are too fragile to be handled by another. The statue stared down, indifferent, while the marble floor reflected the grey light of afternoon. Meredith's death remained, like the museum itself, a collection of fragments, the missing page, the wrong poem, the altered inscription. Each fragment incomplete, yet together they formed a pattern, if only I had the courage to admit it. When I finally stepped outside, the rain had deepened into a steady fall, washing the streets into a dull sheen. The city moved around me with its usual haste, umbrellas bobbing like small shields against the inevitable. I carried no umbrella, only the faint echo of her words and the conviction that a confession, once spoken, is never entirely retractable. The Ashmolean had not given me certainty. It had given me fragments. And perhaps, I thought, fragments were all I was ever meant to have. The cloisters lay empty when I arrived, the arches casting long shadows that pooled against the flagstones like ink spilled across parchment. Oxford at dusk has a way of reminding one that the city's heart is measured not in beats but in echoes. I walked slowly, each footfall a small disturbance in the quiet, noting the way the rain had left the stones slick yet polished, as though preserving the steps of those who had come before. I thought of Meredith, of the missing page, the altered inscription, the wrong poem. The fragments of his final days seemed to linger here, suspended in the damp air, as though the cloisters themselves had absorbed them. The silence was not merely absence of sound, it was a presence, pressing lightly against the mind, inviting reflection, even confession. A figure appeared at the far end of the quadrangle, moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to the corridors, yet hesitant, almost fearful. It was the student. She stopped beneath the archway, and I did not approach immediately. There are moments in Oxford when presence alone is sufficient, when speech risks disturbing the pattern of thought. She did not speak, merely held her hands together, and I understood that what she carried, her confession, her knowledge of Meredith's final days, was heavy enough without words to set it down prematurely. I walked toward her at last. Slowly, each step measured. I asked nothing. She offered no explanation. Only her eyes, large and dark, flickered briefly toward the missing page, then away, toward the rain-soaked courtyard. In that glance, the essence of the confession resided. She had seen, she had known, she had held, and yet she was not the hand that altered the inscription, nor the hand that delivered the wrong poem. Her silence confirmed her innocence in action, though not in consequence. We moved along the cloister together, our steps echoing in tandem. I noted the way she adjusted her sleeve, the faint smudge of graphite at her fingertips, a mark of her careful copying, her obsessive fidelity to Meredith's texts. It was a gesture small enough to be overlooked, yet it spoke of her attentiveness, her participation in a world of letters where minor acts carry weight beyond their size. A gesture, I realized, is sometimes a more precise clue than words. We paused beneath a window overlooking the inner garden. The rain had ceased, leaving the cobblestones slick and dark, reflections trembling faintly in the puddles. She said at last that Meredith had been afraid not of death itself, but of what might survive his error, distortion, and the misreading of his work. He had entrusted her with fragments, and she had done what she could. But the wrong poem, the missing page, the altered inscription, they had been instruments of something larger, a pattern she could not interrupt. I listened without comment, letting the words settle. Silence in Oxford has its own eloquence. The cloisters, empty now of steps but full of echoes, bore witness to her account without judgment. One recalls, in moments like this, that human action leaves traces, and so does inaction. Both are recorded in the margins, in gestures, in glances, in the spaces between speech. I left her then beneath the arches, and she melted into the growing dusk, moving with the quiet purpose of one who carries knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud. The cloisters remained deserted again, yet charged with presence. I traced my steps slowly back toward the gatehouse, feeling the weight of fragments and omissions, of truths partially told. Meredith's life, like these stones, had endured through shadow and silence. And in the absence of sound, one can sometimes hear more than words will ever reveal. The diary lay beneath the desk lamp, its leather cover softened by time, the pages fanning slightly as though eager to be read. I had hesitated before opening it, knowing that diaries are neither holy confession nor holy history. They are shadows cast by the hand of the writer, glimpses of thought distilled into ink. Meredith's hand was careful, deliberate, each letter forming a bridge between what he meant and what the page might betray. I turned to the last entry, dated a week before his death. The lines began as usual, reflections on lectures, annotations on texts, references to students and colleagues, all rendered in his precise hand. And then the tone shifted, the cursive loosening slightly, a tremor betraying the weight of what he could not fully articulate. He wrote of fear, not of failing in scholarship, nor of bodily infirmity, but of being misunderstood, of having a life carefully curated and annotated, twisted by those who could not appreciate its delicacy. The page ended mid-sentence, a dash trailing into blank space, as though the pen had been lifted at the exact moment the reason faltered. I remembered the student's glance in the cloisters, the subtle pressure of her fingertips, the graphite smudge that marked her fidelity to his words. She had said he trusted her and had asked her to guard fragments. And here, in his diary, were fragments of thought left behind, more eloquent in their incompleteness than any finished essay could hope to be. I could trace the line of his mind, the points where anxiety had flickered, the moments where he had paused, the hesitation between intention and expression. The crossword from the previous night, half completed on my desk, seemed to offer its own commentary, final mark, unfinished thought 7. The answer, naturally enough, was lacuna, a gap, a space deliberately left for discovery, or for concealment. Meredith had lived and written in lacunae, in margins, in spaces between assertion and doubt. And now, in this last diary line, the principle was manifest, her final exercise in deliberate absence. I pondered the missing page, the wrong poem, the altered inscription. Each had been a fragment, a whisper of intention disrupted by unseen hands. Yet the diary, in its abrupt ending, was entirely his own, unmediated by intervention. There was a subtle satisfaction in that the one artifact untampered by others, a final line that bore his mind's true weight. I traced the dash with my finger, feeling the tremor in ink as one might feel the pulse in a manuscript. I rose and walked to the window, looking down upon the quad. Students hurried across the stones, umbrellas open, their voices carried faintly by the rain. The city was indifferent, moving past the fragments of a life now concluded. I thought of the chaplain's muted assurances, of Forbes's thin smiles, of the students' silent gestures. Each had played a part, consciously or not, in the orchestration of events, in the shaping of the narrative that Meredith had left behind. Returning to the diary, I read the preceding entries once more, noting small details previously overlooked. A smudge in the margin, a dot that might have been a period or a tear in the paper, a line crossed out lightly, almost reverently. Each was a clue, a moment of intent recorded with the discretion of a scholar. It was in these subtleties that Meredith's final lesson resided life. Like text, can be misread, miscopied, misunderstood, yet even incomplete. Even altered, it leaves traces that, if observed carefully, reveal a pattern. I closed the diary gently, laying it flat. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the cobblestones gleaming under street lamps, reflecting fragments of light as though the city itself were annotating the night. I carried with me the weight of Meredith's final line, the empty dash, the lacuna that was both ending and beginning, and understood that some conclusions arrive not with certainty, but with the careful attention of a mind willing to read between lines.